Marriage actually comes before your kids. I know that's a provocative thing to say, but it's true. Your relationship with your kids is important.
Yes.
But it's not covenantal. Your marriage is a covenant. Your relationship with your kids is an outgrowth of a covenant. They're under your stewardship. But covenantal relationships are ones that we saw with Abraham and David and Israel and, of course, Jesus. That idea of marriage being a covenant is a big, big deal. In fact,
something just cracked open online, and the internet is absolutely losing control trying to make sense of it. A wave of alleged leaked details surrounding Charlie Kirk and Erika Kirk has suddenly taken over social media, and the claims being thrown around are getting more intense by the hour. What started as quiet online whispers about private family tension has now exploded into full-blown speculation about a supposed will change, relationship breakdown rumors, and hidden conflicts that allegedly unfolded behind closed doors long before the public ever saw anything unusual. But here's where things get complicated, because none of this is officially confirmed. There is no verified document, no authenticated statement, no legal confirmation. Just screenshots, anonymous posts, and viral commentary spreading like wildfire across platforms where emotion moves faster than facts. And yet, people can't stop talking. Because according to the online narrative circulating right now, something major may have shifted in Charlie Kirk's final personal arrangements. And some users believe that shift may have reflected deeper issues inside the marriage that were never publicly acknowledged. At the same time, others are pushing back hard, saying this is exactly how the internet works now. Old clips, fragmented claims, and emotional storytelling get stitched together into something that feels like a revelation, even when nothing concrete exists behind it. And that's why this situation is blowing up. Because you're not just dealing with one claim, you're dealing with two completely opposite interpretations of the same silence. One side believes there's something being hidden. The other insists it's pure internet fabrication. And in the middle of it all are millions of viewers trying to figure out what is real, what is rumor, and what is just another viral distortion. But then came the moment that pushed everything into overdrive. Because a new round of posts began circulating claiming that people close to the situation are now reacting behind the scenes. And that whatever the truth is, it's far more complicated than the internet originally assumed. And just like that, the story stopped being about one rumor and started becoming something much bigger and much harder to control. And what happens next is exactly why everyone is still watching. Before the internet exploded into theories, before the comment sections turned into full-blown investigations, and before every old clip started being replayed like evidence in a courtroom, there was a very different public story being told. A story of stability, a story of values. A story centered around Charlie Kirk and Erika Kirk as a couple who represented a certain public image, discipline, tradition, and a carefully constructed sense of moral clarity that resonated strongly with a large audience. For years, that image held firm in the public eye. Charlie Kirk was widely recognized as a political commentator and activist who built his platform around cultural commentary, youth engagement, and strong ideological positioning. His public persona was sharp, structured, and highly visible in media spaces where political identity and personal values often overlap. Meanwhile, Erika Kirk was introduced to audiences through a different lens. Not just as a private individual, but as someone aligned with a broader public narrative about family values, faith, and lifestyle discipline. And that combination, public activism on one side and carefully presented personal alignment on the other, is what made their relationship so widely discussed and closely observed. Because in today's digital world, couples who exist in the public sphere are never just couples anymore. They become symbols. And symbols are always under pressure. At first, everything appeared consistent. Public appearances matched the messaging. Interviews reinforced the same themes. Social media posts reflected a curated version of stability and alignment. But what makes internet culture so unpredictable is this. The more polished a public image looks, the more people begin to wonder what sits outside the frame. And that curiosity is exactly where everything begins to shift. Over time, online audiences started revisiting older content connected to Erika Kirk, not because of a specific incident, but because of a growing pattern in digital behavior. The habit of re-examining public figures through archived moments, past interviews, and resurfaced clips. In many cases, this leads to harmless nostalgia. But in high-profile political and media environments, it often turns into something else entirely, reinterpretation. and reinterpretation is where speculation begins to form. Small inconsistencies, forgotten interviews, casual remarks, and lifestyle snapshots begin to be reanalyzed under a new lens, not as isolated moments, but as pieces of a larger puzzle. That is exactly what started happening here. At the same time, the public relationship between Charlie Kirk and Erika Kirk was being viewed through an increasingly polarized audience space. Supporters often saw them as aligned in values and purpose, while critics tended to scrutinize them more intensely, looking for contradictions between public messaging and private life. This kind of dual perception creates a unique environment online, one where the same couple can be interpreted in completely opposite ways depending on the viewer's perspective. And once that split perception forms, even the smallest detail can become amplified. A paused interview clip, a resurfaced post, a quote taken slightly out of context, a timeline misinterpreted through hindsight. Each piece becomes part of a larger narrative that evolves not through verified information, but through collective interpretation. And that's the environment where everything eventually escalates. Because as interest grows, so does speculation. And as speculation grows, people begin searching for connections that may not actually exist, linking unrelated events, comparing separate timelines, and building emotional theories that feel cohesive, even when they are not grounded in confirmed facts. This is also where public curiosity about private life becomes intense. People begin asking questions like, what was the relationship really like behind the scenes? Did public messaging fully reflect private reality? Were there moments the audience never saw? These questions don't come from evidence. They come from engagement, from curiosity, from the human tendency to fill in gaps when information is incomplete. And once those gaps exist long enough in a high-visibility environment, the internet inevitably starts filling them in on its own. That is how narrative ecosystems form. Not from one moment, but from thousands of interpretations layered on top of each other. And in this case, the ecosystem surrounding Charlie Kirk and Erika Kirk began to grow rapidly once older content, interviews, and personal commentary started resurfacing in algorithm-driven cycles. Some viewers saw consistency, others saw contradictions, and both groups began reinforcing their own interpretations through repeated discussion. At that point, the story was no longer just about a public couple. It became about perception itself. And perception, once it fractures, rarely returns to a single unified version. Because now every new piece of information, no matter how small, is filtered through an existing belief system. Supporters interpret it one way, critics interpret it another, and neutral observers slowly get pulled into one direction or the other, simply by exposure. This is the exact environment where online theories begin to take shape without any central source confirming them. Not because something is proven, but because something feels incomplete. And when something feels incomplete in a high-profile narrative, the internet rarely waits for clarity. It builds its own version instead. And that is where the real shift begins. The shift that turns background context into active controversy and turns public figures into subjects of constant reinterpretation. Because once a story reaches that stage, it no longer belongs to the people involved. It belongs to the audience watching it unfold. The moment everything shifted wasn't loud at first. It didn't come from an official statement. It didn't come from a verified source. It came from something far more powerful in today's digital world, a sudden wave of resurfaced content and fragmented claims that began circulating at the exact same time across multiple platforms. And at the center of the storm were Charlie Kirk and Erika Kirk once again. At first, it looked like just another internet cycle. Old clips resurfacing, commentary accounts reposting interviews, short edits designed to trigger engagement and emotional reactions. But then something changed. People started connecting unrelated moments together, not because they were confirmed, but because they felt connected when placed side by side. A single interview clip where Erika discussed her personal values was suddenly being replayed alongside older social media posts. A separate podcast moment was being reinterpreted in a completely different emotional context. And slowly, a narrative began forming, not through evidence but through pattern recognition. That's when the first twist appeared online. Not a verified revelation, but a collective interpretation that something in the public image did not fully align with newly resurfaced material. And once that idea took hold, everything escalated, because now people weren't just watching content, they were analyzing it, frame by frame, sentence by sentence, tone by tone. Every pause became meaningful, every smile became questionable, Every contradiction, real or imagined, became a clue. And in that environment, even neutral moments start to feel loaded. One of the most widely shared clips showed Erika speaking about lifestyle choices, values, and personal discipline in a calm, structured tone. To many viewers at the time, it was just another standard interview moment. But in the new wave of reinterpretation, that same clip was being reframed as evidence of a constructed narrative. Not because anything in the clip had changed, but because the audience had changed. And that shift is what made everything feel like a first twist, even though nothing concrete had actually been introduced. At the same time, commentary spaces began amplifying the discussion. Creators across platforms started breaking down timelines, reposting old footage, and offering competing interpretations of the same material. Some insisted there was nothing unusual at all, just a normal public figure being misinterpreted through hindsight bias. Others argued that the consistency of certain storytelling patterns felt too precise to ignore. And that's where the real conflict began. Because once two opposing interpretations form, the internet doesn't settle. It splits. One side sees coincidence, the other sees intention. One side sees normal human inconsistency. The other sees hidden structure, and neither side is willing to fully concede ground. As engagement increased, so did emotional intensity. Comment sections became battlegrounds. Debates turned personal, and every new repost of old content reignited the same arguments again and again. But the most important shift wasn't in what people were saying. It was in what people started believing they had noticed themselves. Because once viewers feel like they've discovered something on their own, the belief becomes stronger than any external explanation. That's when the narrative moved into its next phase. A second layer of content began circulating, not new evidence, but reinterpretations of older moments tied to personal stories, relationships, and public appearances. And suddenly, everything was being viewed through a different emotional lens. Even harmless clips were being assigned, meaning they were never originally intended to carry. That's when the first twist truly solidified online. Not as a fact, but as a shared feeling that something about the public narrative had become unstable. And instability is what drives viral momentum. Because people don't share certainty. They share confusion. They share suspicion. They share unresolved emotion. And that is exactly what began to spread. As the discussion intensified, both supporters and critics of the narrative began digging deeper into archived material, trying to reinforce their positions. Supporters pointed to consistency in public messaging and argued that the growing wave of speculation was simply the result of selective editing and emotional framing. Critics, on the other hand, focused on perceived inconsistencies in tone, timing, and narrative evolution across different appearances. But the key issue was this: both sides were working from the same fragmented dataset, and fragmented data always produces multiple conclusions. That's why the conflict became impossible to resolve in comment sections or reaction videos. Because every new angle created another interpretation. Every explanation created another counter-argument. And every attempt to clarify only added more fuel to the discussion. At the center of all this remained the same core figures, Charlie Kirk and Erika Kirk, whose public presence had now become the focal point of a much larger online debate about how identity is perceived in the digital age. But even that focus began to expand. Because once people become invested in a narrative, they start looking for patterns everywhere. Not just in one relationship, but across timelines, interviews, and unrelated public appearances. And that expansion is what turns a small wave of speculation into a full-scale internet event. By the time the first twist phase fully took hold, the story was no longer about one clip or one interview. It had become about interpretation itself. And interpretation, once it spreads, is nearly impossible to contain. Because now the audience is no longer reacting to content. They are actively building the story in real time. And the moment that happens, the narrative stops being controlled by facts and starts being driven by perception. And what comes next in this unfolding discussion is where things begin to escalate beyond anything the early audience expected. The moment the conversation stopped being contained inside niche commentary circles, everything changed. What had started as fragmented discussions about resurfaced clips and interpreted interviews involving Charlie Kirk and Erika Kirk suddenly broke into mainstream algorithm circulation. And once that happens online, there is no slowing it down. Because algorithms don't wait for verification, they wait for engagement. And engagement was exploding. Short clips began circulating everywhere, Each one stripped of original context, each one framed with emotionally charged captions, each one designed to provoke immediate reaction before reflection could even happen. But something new was happening now. The narrative was evolving, not through new facts, but through reinterpretation stacking on top of reinterpretation. One clip became 3 interpretations. 3 interpretations became 10 threads. 10 threads became a full-blown debate ecosystem. And in that ecosystem, something people were calling a shocking reveal began forming. Not as a single event, but as a collective belief shift. The idea spreading online was simple but powerful. What if the public version of events has always been incomplete? That question alone was enough to ignite another wave of escalation. Because once people accept that framing, every old clip becomes potential evidence. Every interview becomes a clue. Every timeline becomes a puzzle. And every pause becomes suspicious. At the center of this escalation were repeated discussions around past appearances, public messaging, and personal storytelling involving Erika Kirk. Some users began compiling comparison threads, placing older interviews next to newer statements, highlighting differences in phrasing, tone, and emphasis. Supporters pushed back immediately, arguing that this was classic selective framing, taking years of content and compressing it into a misleading narrative. But critics countered that consistency matters, and even small shifts in narrative presentation can indicate deeper evolution or hidden complexity. Neither side could fully prove their interpretation, but both sides could build convincing emotional arguments, and that is what made the situation feel like it was revealing something, even when no confirmed revelation existed. Meanwhile, commentary channels across platforms began escalating their own coverage. Some framed it as a case study in how public perception distorts reality. Others leaned into more dramatic framing, suggesting that more layers are coming, or that the full picture has not yet been seen. That language alone kept audiences hooked. Because not yet seen implies hidden structure, and hidden structure implies future payoff, and future payoff is what drives watch time. But the most intense escalation came when older, unrelated moments were pulled into the discussion and reinterpreted under the new narrative lens. Casual interviews became evidence of inconsistency. Lifestyle comments became signals of contradiction. Even normal public behavior was being reassessed as potentially symbolic. And once that reinterpretation cycle begins, it becomes self-sustaining. The audience no longer needs new information. They recycle existing content and extract new meaning from it. At that point, the story stops growing outward and starts growing inward. Deeper interpretation, stronger emotional framing, more intense speculation, and increasingly polarized reactions. One group argued that this entire situation is a textbook example of internet overanalysis, where fragmented content is being stitched together into a narrative that never existed in reality. They emphasized that public figures often have complex, evolving lives that do not fit neatly into online timelines. The other group argued the opposite, that the volume of inconsistencies being pointed out cannot simply be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding, and that there must be more context not visible in public archives. And that clash created the escalation point, because now the discussion wasn't about individual clips anymore. It was about trust, about whether public narratives can be taken at face value, and about whether online audiences are capable of reconstructing truth from fragmented digital footprints. As the debate intensified, another wave of content appeared, this time focused not on new claims but on reactions to the claims themselves. Creators began analyzing other creators. Audiences began analyzing analysts, and the conversation became recursive, a loop of interpretation feeding interpretation. This is where the shocking reveal narrative took its strongest hold. Because instead of one clear discovery, audiences were now experiencing a layered sensation of discovery happening repeatedly, as if every new breakdown was uncovering something deeper. But the truth underneath all of it was more unstable than anyone wanted to admit. Nothing had actually been confirmed. No central verified disclosure had emerged. No authoritative document had changed the situation. What had changed was perception. And perception, once amplified across millions of viewers, can feel more powerful than evidence itself. That's why engagement kept climbing. That's why clips kept spreading. And that's why the conversation refused to settle. Because now, every viewer believed they were one video away from understanding the real story. And that belief is what keeps people watching. As the escalation continued, one final shift began forming in the background. The story was no longer about what happened. It was about what people believed might have happened. And that distinction is exactly where the next phase begins. By the time the discussion surrounding Charlie Kirk and Erika Kirk reached its peak online intensity, the conversation had already stopped behaving like a normal internet debate. It was no longer confined to one platform. It wasn't just commentary accounts anymore. It had turned into a multi-layered reaction ecosystem, where every new post triggered 10 more responses, and every interpretation immediately split into opposing narratives. And the most striking part? There was no single agreed-upon version of what people were reacting to. Some audiences were reacting to resurfaced interviews. Others were reacting to edited clips circulating on short-form platforms. And many were reacting not to content itself, but to other people's interpretations of that content. That alone created a completely unstable environment. Because now the reaction was not just emotional, it was recursive. One layer reacting to another layer, reacting to another layer. And in that environment, clarity disappears very quickly. Across social platforms, two dominant camps began to form. The first group pushed back strongly against the entire wave of speculation. They argued that the situation being discussed online had become a textbook example of digital distortion, where selective editing, emotional framing, and algorithm-driven repetition were shaping a narrative that did not reflect verified reality. From their perspective, what people were seeing wasn't evidence of anything hidden. It was evidence of how easily context can be lost online. They pointed out that public figures are constantly re-evaluated through hindsight, and that normal evolution over time can look like contradiction when viewed through fragmented content. The second group, however, interpreted everything very differently. To them, the sheer volume of discussion itself was meaningful. They argued that when so many unrelated clips, interviews, and posts begin to feel connected, it suggests that audiences are picking up on something real, even if it cannot yet be fully articulated. They framed it not as conspiracy, but as pattern recognition. And that language, pattern recognition, spread quickly across threads and comment sections, becoming a kind of shorthand for suspicion, without requiring direct evidence. Meanwhile, commentary creators played a major role in amplifying the divide. Some took a cautious approach, repeatedly reminding audiences that online narratives often grow faster than verified information. Others leaned into the emotional intensity of the moment, framing the situation as an unfolding mystery with multiple unresolved layers. That contrast only deepened audience polarization. Because now viewers weren't just choosing what to believe about the situation, they were choosing which type of commentator to trust. And that is where the dynamic shifted again. On one side, audiences demanded restraint, accuracy, and skepticism toward viral claims. On the other, audiences demanded deeper investigation, more breakdowns, and continued exploration of inconsistencies, even if they were unverified. Both sides believed they were defending truth. But they were operating with entirely different definitions of what truth meant in a fragmented digital environment. As the debate expanded, social media timelines became saturated with reaction content. Breakdown videos analyzing old interviews, threads compiling alleged inconsistencies, counterthreads debunking viral interpretations, emotional commentary videos questioning media literacy, and every piece of content reinforced the same cycle. Watch, react, reinterpret, repost, escalate. At this point, even neutral observers began feeling pulled into the narrative simply by exposure. Because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates perceived importance, and perceived importance creates curiosity. That curiosity is what kept engagement climbing. Outside of social media, broader commentary spaces began acknowledging the situation indirectly, not by confirming any claims, but by discussing the phenomenon itself. Writers and analysts began focusing on how quickly narratives can form around public figures in the digital age, especially when old content is resurfaced and reinterpreted without context. The discussion shifted from what is true to why do these stories spread so fast? And that question added another layer of legitimacy to the overall conversation, even for people who were skeptical of the underlying claims, because it reframed the entire situation as a cultural moment rather than a specific incident. But inside online spaces, the emotional tone remained far more intense. For many users, this wasn't abstract media analysis, it was personal belief formation. Some felt convinced that the narrative being constructed online revealed deeper truths about public image versus private reality. Others felt frustrated that unverified interpretations were being treated as meaningful signals at all. and both groups increasingly accused the other of being either too naive or too speculative. That conflict kept the engagement cycle alive. And more importantly, it ensured that the story never stabilized, because stability kills virality, and instability fuels it. By the end of this wave of reactions, one thing had become clear across platforms. The conversation was no longer about a single figure, a single interview, or a single claim. It had evolved into a broader reflection of how audiences consume, interpret, and emotionally reconstruct public narratives in real time. And that realization set the stage for the next phase of the story, where interpretation itself becomes the central conflict. By the time the conversation reached its peak intensity, the situation surrounding Charlie Kirk and Erika Kirk had already transformed into something far bigger than anyone expected at the beginning. What started as scattered commentary, resurfaced clips, and interpretive breakdowns had now evolved into a full-scale digital phenomenon, where every new post didn't just add information, it reshaped how everything that came before it was understood. And that's where the final twist began to form. Not from a confirmed revelation, not from an official statement, but from a sudden shift in how audiences were reacting to the entire narrative itself. Because for the first time, even some of the most engaged commentary spaces started changing tone. Instead of introducing new claims or deeper interpretations, creators began stepping back and discussing something different entirely. How unstable the narrative had become. How quickly context was being lost. How rapidly interpretation was replacing verified information. And that shift created a strange effect across platforms. People weren't being told new details anymore. They were being told to question the process itself. And that, more than anything else, changed the direction of the entire conversation. Because once audiences start questioning how they form their beliefs, the narrative stops growing outward and starts collapsing inward. At the same time, older clips, interviews, and posts involving Erika Kirk were still circulating at high speed. But something subtle had changed in how they were being received. Where earlier reactions were emotional and immediate, newer reactions were slower, more cautious, and increasingly divided. Some viewers began rewatching content not to find new clues, but to verify whether previous interpretations still held up under a more critical lens. Others doubled down on their earlier conclusions, convinced that the growing skepticism was simply a pushback against uncomfortable truths. And that divide created a final layer of instability. Because now there were no longer just two interpretations. There were interpretations of interpretations, and that recursive loop made resolution almost impossible. Inside this environment, even neutral commentary began to feel like participation in the narrative. Every breakdown video became part of the story. Every analysis became a continuation of the debate. And every attempt to clarify only added more angles for people to argue from. But the final shift, the true cliffhanger moment, came when audiences began noticing something unexpected. The story was no longer being driven forward by new content, but by old content being reactivated in new emotional cycles. A clip that had been ignored months earlier suddenly resurfaced. An interview that once felt ordinary was now being dissected frame by frame. A comment that previously went unnoticed was suddenly being treated as significant. And that's when people started asking a new question entirely. Are we actually discovering anything new? Or are we just reinterpreting the same material over and over again? That question hit harder than any single claim, because it undermined the entire structure of the discussion. And once that doubt entered the conversation, everything became unstable again. Some viewers began to disengage, saying the narrative had become impossible to verify and too heavily shaped by speculation. Others leaned even deeper into analysis, convinced that pulling apart inconsistencies was the only way to approach truth in a fragmented digital landscape. And both reactions only fueled the cycle further, because disengagement reduces clarity, and deeper engagement increases speculation, and speculation keeps the story alive. Meanwhile, commentary creators began hinting at something new potentially coming, not necessarily evidence, but additional context, clarification, or follow-up perspectives that could shift how earlier discussions are understood. But nothing concrete was confirmed, nothing definitive was released, just anticipation. And anticipation is the most powerful fuel in online storytelling, because it keeps audiences watching even when nothing is happening. It keeps them waiting for the moment when everything will finally make sense. But the uncomfortable truth emerging from this entire situation is that sense may not be coming in the way people expect. Because the more fragmented the narrative becomes, the more difficult it is to rebuild a single coherent version of it. And that's where the cliffhanger truly lands. Not in a new claim, not in a new revelation, but in the realization that the audience itself has become part of the story's evolution. What people believe now shapes what they look for next. What they look for next shapes what they interpret. And what they interpret shapes what spreads. So the question is no longer just about what is true, but about what the internet is collectively turning this story into. And as the next wave of content begins to circulate once again, one final uncertainty remains hanging in the air. Is there another layer to this story that hasn't been seen yet? Or has the audience simply reached the point where perception has completely overtaken reality? And until that answer arrives, the conversation is not ending, it's mutating. And just like that, we've reached the point where nothing in this story feels simple anymore. What started as scattered online commentary surrounding Charlie Kirk and Erika Kirk has now turned into one of those rare internet moments where everyone is watching the same content, but nobody is seeing it the same way. And that's exactly why the conversation is still exploding. Because depending on who you ask, this is either a case of the internet overanalyzing normal public content, or a deeper example of how fragmented narratives can completely reshape perception over time. And right now, both sides are completely locked in. So here's the question you need to answer for yourself. When you look at everything that has been circulating online, do you think people are genuinely uncovering inconsistencies worth discussing? Or do you think the internet is doing what it always does, taking disconnected moments, amplifying them, and turning them into something far bigger than they were ever meant to be? And more importantly, why do stories like this spread so fast in the first place? Why do old clips suddenly feel new again when they're placed in a different emotional context? And why does every additional interpretation make the original situation feel even less clear? Because that's the part nobody can ignore anymore. The reaction itself has become part of the story. And whether you agree or disagree with the direction of the discussion, one thing is undeniable. People are deeply divided, and that division is what's keeping this conversation alive. Now I want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Not just what you believe, but why you believe it. What convinced you? What raised questions for you? What part of this entire discussion stood out the most? Let's see how different perspectives shape this conversation in real time. And if you're following this situation closely, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because if anything new, relevant, or clarifying ever comes out, you'll hear about it the moment it breaks. But until then, remember this. In the age of viral media, the story doesn't end when the clip stops. It ends when the audience stops questioning it. And right now, that moment is nowhere near happening.